The laughter started before the auctioneer even looked up. It moved through the crowd, the way cold moves through a barn wall, finding every crack spreading without effort, until 200 men standing in 19-degree air on a November morning in Crail County, Iowa, had something to agree on. The agreement was this. The girl at the back of the yard did not belong there. She was small for 14. The brown wool coat she wore had been bought for someone larger, and never replaced the sleeves falling past her wrists, the hem dropping almost to her knees. On her hands were a pair of leather work gloves stiff with age, the kind a man wears every day for 20 years until the leather becomes a second skin. Under her arm, pressed flat against her side, was a small white envelope. She held a bitter's paddle in both hands at chest height, and she stood very still in the way of someone who has thought carefully about how to be invisible and has not quite succeeded. Her name was Nora Calloway. She was 14 years old. She had ridden the rural bus from Mitchellville alone, paid $1.45 in exact change, and walked from the bus stop to the fairgrounds entrance through air so cold it hurt to breathe through the nose. She had not told anyone she was coming. Not Agnes Tully, the elderly woman she lived with. Not her teacher. Not the neighbors on Maple Street who might have recognized her and asked the kind of questions she had no interest in answering. She had been planning this day for 9 months. To understand why you have to go back 28 years. You have to go back to a January that the older men in that auction yard had either lived through themselves or heard about from their fathers, the way you hear about certain winters not as weather, but as events that divide a life into before and after. You have to go back to Gideon Calloway. Gideon was born in 1918 in Crail County, the son of a farmer and the grandson of a farmer, which in central Iowa in those years was not remarkable. What he did with the land he worked was remarkable, but it took time to become visible the way most things worth seeing do. He enlisted in 1942 at 24, served in the European theater, came home in 1946 with a Bronze Star. He put in a drawer and never displayed, and a quiet that settled over him like weather and never entirely lifted. With his mustering out pay and the money he had saved before the war, he bought 320 acres in northeastern Crail County. Good ground. The kind of Iowa soil laid down by glaciers 10,000 years ago that had been growing things without complaint ever since. He bought equipment piece by piece as he could afford it, paying cash each time, and in 1949 he bought a Farmall M tractor, knew driving it home on the county road himself with the keys in his hand and the engine running smooth beneath him. That tractor became the machine he relied on most. Not because it was the newest, not because it was the most powerful, because of what he had rigged it to do over 2 winters of trial and adjustment that nobody had asked him to undertake and that he had undertaken anyway because he was the kind of man who thought about what might go wrong before it went wrong. The Farmall M had a power takeoff shaft on the rear, which most farmers use to run stationary equipment in a fixed location. Gideon had built a portable water pump assembly that connected to that shaft, mounted on a steel skid that could be loaded into the back of a trailer in under 10 minutes. He had run insulated lines along the pump housing and routed exhaust heat from the engine block through a secondary channel to keep the lines from freezing in extreme cold. He had tested it at -10. He had tested it at -15. He had tested it because he was the kind of man who understood that you do not discover whether a thing works when you need it to work for the first time. He needed it for the first time on January 14th, 1959. The ice storm that hit central Iowa that Thursday afternoon was classified afterward by the National Weather Service as one of the worst freezing rain events in the recorded history of the upper Midwest. Rain that began at 2 in the afternoon and did not stop for 31 hours. By the time it ended, every power line, every telephone line, every fence wire across 6 counties was coated in 2.5 inches of solid ice. Trees split apart under the weight. Roofs collapsed. Roads became sheets of ice so smooth and steep in places that no wheeled vehicle could move on them at all. The power went out and stayed out. The temperature dropped to -18 the first night, -22 the second. In barns across Crail County, something was happening that every farmer who owned those barns understood immediately and could do nothing about. Cattle drink between 10 and 30 gallons of water a day every day without exception, without negotiation. Regardless of whether the power is out and the tank heaters have stopped, and the hand pumps have frozen solid in their housings 3 feet underground. By the morning of January 16th, 2 days in cattle all over the county were pawing at empty troughs. Gideon Calloway was 41 years old that January. He had been up since before the storm ended, checking his animals, checking his equipment, checking the ice on the county roads, with the careful eye of a man who had learned over many winters to read what frozen ground was willing to give and what it was not. He had his own cattle to water. He had his own problems. He was one man on a farm in the worst ice storm in a generation, with temperatures that had not risen above 0 in 3 days. He looked at the Farmall M. He looked at the pump assembly on its steel skid in the corner of the equipment shed. He looked at Voorhees Creek along the eastern edge of his property, which had not frozen completely, even in this cold, because the water moved fast enough over the limestone bed to resist it. Then Gideon Calloway hitched the pump rig to the Farmall M and drove out onto the ice roads. No one had called him. There was no coordinated relief effort, no county plan, no phone tree that could have operated anyway because the telephone lines were all down. He simply understood what was happening in the barns around him and understood that he had the one piece of equipment in his part of the county capable of addressing it. He drove because there was work in front of him that needed doing, and he was the person who could do it. He spent the next 9 days driving from farm to farm. He would pump water from Voorhees Creek into a 200-gallon tank mounted behind the tractor drive to a neighbor's farm on roads so slick the farm all slid sideways into roadside ditches, twice requiring hours of handwork to free it each time. He would pump the water into the stock tanks, drive back to the creek, refill drive to the next farm. He did this in temperatures that hit -22 overnight. He did it sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night in the cab of the Farmall M while the tank refilled, waking with ice on the inside of the windows, and his breath crystallized on his collar. On the third morning, a man named Stu Farley stepped into the road ahead of him. Farley was shaking his hands pale inside his coat pockets, his voice cracking from 2 nights of no sleep and no water for his animals. He said there was no reason Gideon should go to Warren Pruitt's farm before his own. He said if Gideon didn't come to his place first, he would pull him off that seat himself. Gideon stopped the Farmall. He looked at Farley for a moment without speaking. "Your barn has a well on the east side," he said. "Frozen at the top, not the bottom. Take a sledgehammer to the casing at 3 feet down. You will have water by noon." Then he drove around Stu Farley and kept going. 3 hours later, Farley found the water exactly where Gideon had said it would be. He drove out to the 12th farm Gideon was working that afternoon and stood in the cold for 2 hours holding the end of a water line without being asked, without explanation, without a single word exchanged between them. On the morning of the 3rd day, Gideon drove the Farmall M to a dairy farm in northeastern Crail County, owned by Warren Pruitt, who was 36 years old that winter. Pruitt had 8 dairy cattle in his barn. He had been at their empty troughs since before sunrise, knowing what was coming, knowing he had no way to stop it. He had tried the hand pump 6 times through the night, frozen solid at 3 feet down. He had melted snow on the wood stove and carried it out in buckets, and he had run the arithmetic on it in his head, and the arithmetic was brutal, and there was no way around it. He was standing in the barn doorway at 6 in the morning, looking out at a world that was entirely white and entirely still when he heard something that should not have existed on that road in those conditions. The sound of an engine. He stood there for a moment, not believing it. Then he walked out to the road. The Farmall M came around the bend with steam rising off the engine block and ice caked on the front wheels. And Gideon Calloway sitting in the cab with his face half hidden under the brim of his work cap and his breath coming in short clouds in the cold air. The 200-gallon tank behind the tractor was nearly full, the water steaming faintly in the morning freeze. Gideon cut the engine, climbed down, looked at Warren standing in the road. "You all right, Warren?" Warren Pruitt was 36 years old. He had worked this farm through hard winters and had thought of himself as the kind of man who did not break. He stood in the road in front of his neighbor and felt his throat close so completely. It was 30 seconds before he could say anything at all. "I am now," he said. And he was not ashamed of what came after that. Not on that morning, not standing in front of a man who had driven through an ice storm in -22 weather to bring water to his cattle. Gideon pumped water into the Pruitt stock tanks for 40 minutes. He refused breakfast. He refused coffee. He climbed back onto the Farmall, looked at Warren standing by the barn. 6 more farms before lunch. "Warren, I have to keep moving." He drove away down the ice road. Warren stood at his gate and watched the Farmall M disappear around the bend. He stood there until he could no longer hear the engine. Then he went back into his barn and stood with his cattle while they drank. He never forgot that morning. Not in 34 years. Not through the good years and the hard years and the years the farm barely broke even. Not through his first wife's death in 1974, or the slow climb back from that, or the second chance he had not expected. The sound of that engine coming around the bend on January 18, 1959, was the sound he carried with more clarity than almost anything else in his life. 9 days, 47 farms, 3,200 head of cattle. Every dollar offered to him returned without discussion. Gideon Calloway died in the spring of 1986. He was 68 years old. Nora was 13. The farm and everything on it went to settle the bank's debt. The equipment was inventoried, appraised, and scheduled for liquidation. The land was sold at a foreclosure auction to an investment group out of Des Moines that bought things like it not to farm, but to hold, waiting for values to move in a direction that made selling profitable. Nora went to live with Agnes Tully on Maple Street in Mitchellville. Agnes was 71, a widow living on her late husband's pension, and a small amount of savings managed carefully for years because there was no other option. She was not cold. She was not unkind. She was old, and she was tired, and she had not planned for any of this. She was the last available relative. She had said yes when the county called because there was no one else, and because she was not the kind of woman who said no when a child needed somewhere to go. That was enough. That was a great deal, actually. 1 month after Nora moved in, a neighbor named Doris Kemp knocked on the door. Agnes answered. Doris stood on the porch and said in front of Nora that she did not mean to be unkind, but that the child was going to be a burden, and that Agnes was 71 years old, and that there were county programs that handled these situations. Agnes opened the door wider. She looked at Doris without any particular expression. "She is Gideon Calloway's granddaughter," Agnes said. "Gideon Calloway watered my sister's cattle in the winter of '59 when my sister's husband was in the hospital and could not do it himself. This child stays." She closed the door. Nora stood in the hallway and heard every word. She did not say anything. She went back to the kitchen and finished washing the dishes. But something had shifted in the architecture of that borrowed house quietly. And without announcement, the way ground settles after a long freeze finally ends. She had one rule about the plan she was building: do not tell anyone. Not because she was hiding, because the moment you let someone else's doubt inside a plan, the plan starts growing around the doubt instead of the destination. She had watched her grandfather work 9 days in a storm without explaining himself to a single person. She understood the lesson. For 9 months she worked. 3 afternoons a week, most Saturday evenings, babysitting in Mitchellville at 75 cents an hour. 37 straight weeks. She kept the money in a metal cookie tin in the back of her closet and counted it 3 times in the 2 days before the auction to make sure she had not made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. $340. She had asked one question of one person. The neighbor 2 houses down was a retired farmer named Dale Sherwood, 52 years old, a man who used exactly as many words as a situation required, and no more. She had asked him, carefully phrased as general curiosity, what small old tractors went for at foreclosure auctions. Dale had scratched the back of his neck and said that a machine nobody wanted could go for as little as $50 if no real buyer showed up. A machine with no tires and no battery might not see a serious bid at all. She held that information for 9 months, like a compass point, like the thing she steered toward. She did not know if $340 would be enough. She knew it might be. On the morning of November 14th, 1987, she got on the bus. The Crail County Fairgrounds parking lot was already half full by 7. Pickup trucks, mostly a few flatbeds. Men in canvas coats and wool caps, standing in clusters near the entrance, breathing steam into the cold air, talking in the low voices men use at auctions when they do not want anyone to know what they are interested in buying. Nobody was interested in Lot 17. The 1949 Farmall M, sitting at the far end of the equipment line, was not a machine that drew a crowd. 2 flat tires. No battery. The red paint so far gone that in some places it was more rust than color. The kind of tractor that even farmers who needed cheap equipment had already walked past without a second look. One man had kicked one of the flat tires, looked at his boot, shaken his head, and kept walking. That tractor was going to sell for nothing. And everyone at the Crail County Fairgrounds that morning understood this without discussing it. Nora walked to the registration table at 7:45. The clerk, a young woman named Patricia, who had worked these auctions for 3 years and thought she had seen most things, looked at the name the girl wrote on the card. She looked at the girl. She did not ask any questions. She handed her a bidder's paddle. Nora took it and walked into the auction yard. Warren Pruitt had been running auctions at the Crail County Fairgrounds since 1956, 31 years at that podium, through bankruptcies and retirements and deaths, through every variety of human loss that ends with equipment in a fairground and strangers deciding what it is worth. He was good at his job. He was fair. He moved lots efficiently and called the bids cleanly and kept things professional, which in this business meant keeping himself out of it. At 8:55, he flipped through the stack of bidder cards the way he always did, looking for anything irregular. He found it on the 4th card from the top. He stopped, read the name, read it again. Nora Calloway. He looked up from the card and out across 200 men in the cold November air. It took him a moment to find her. She was at the back, small in her oversized coat, holding her paddle in both hands, at chest height, standing very still. Warren Pruitt looked at that girl and felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt since he was 36 years old, standing at a gate on an ice road, watching a tractor disappear around a bend. He set the card down carefully on the podium. The morning's auction ran through its early lots: a grain auger, a working baler, a flatbed trailer that sold for what it was worth. The crowd moved through the standard rhythms of a foreclosure sale: The rhythms of commerce without sentiment of things separated from the stories of the people who used them. Then Warren announced Lot 17. The 1949 Farmall M sold as is, no warranties, no representations. Boyd Crane was standing in the third row. He was a fertilizer salesman from Ames, early 40s, the kind of man whose opinions arrived before he did and stayed after he left. He looked at the Farmall at the end of the equipment line. 2 flat tires. No battery. Rust where the paint used to be. He laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A broadcast laugh designed to carry. $200 for that pile of rust. You would be doing them a favor hauling it to the scrapyard. The men around him laughed. The laughter spread the way. Laughter spreads in a crowd of 200 people who have been standing in 19-degree air for 2 hours and are ready for something, anything, to break the monotony. It spread through the rows across the bleachers until a significant portion of the yard was grinning or chuckling or exchanging glances with the private satisfaction of people who find it comfortable to agree with each other. Warren dropped the opening to $100. Silence. He was about to drop it again when the voice came from the back of the crowd. Small, clear, steady. $100. The laughter came back louder and faster than the first time, because now there was a target for it, and the target was a 14-year-old girl in an oversized wool coat holding a bitters paddle in a dead man's leather gloves. Warren held up his hand. The laughter dropped but did not stop. Young Lady Warren said, his voice carrying the professional distance he had maintained for 31 years at this podium. Are your parents present? Nora looked up at him from the back of the crowd. Her face was pale in the cold. Her chin was steady. My grandfather raised me, she said. He passed last year. I am here on my own. This is a working auction. Minors require a guardian to bid on property. I am 14, sir. Her voice was quiet enough that the crowd had to stop murmuring to hear it. They stopped. Iowa law allows a person 14 or older to enter a contract for the purchase of personal property if they can demonstrate the funds. I have the funds. They are in cash in this envelope. She held up the envelope. Small white, pressed flat from being carried under her arm. The crowd was not laughing anymore. Boyd Crane made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and not quite making it. A few men near him shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Warren Pruitt looked at the girl for a long moment. Then he looked down at the bidder card in his hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already seen, taking it in again more carefully, making sure he is not misreading what is written there. He was not misreading it. Nora Calloway. Gideon Calloway's granddaughter. Warren took off his glasses. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes for a moment that lasted just long enough for the men nearest the podium to notice. Then he put his glasses back on and looked out at the yard with the expression of a man who has just been handed back a debt he thought he would carry to his grave. He looked at Boyd Crane. Mr. Crane, Warren said, and his voice was different now, quieter with a weight in it that made the men standing nearby go still. I'm going to ask you to be quiet for a moment. Crane blinked. Warren turned to face the yard. Most of you were not here in 1959, he said. Most of you do not remember. But in January of that year, this county was hit by an ice storm that knocked out power and roads across 6 counties for 9 days. The temperature dropped to -22. Water systems froze on dozens of farms, and cattle all over this county were dying of thirst in their barns. The older men in the crowd, the men in their 60s and 70s who had been there, went very still. A farmer in northeastern Crail County named Gideon Calloway Warren said, hitched a pump rig to a 1949 Farmall M and drove from farm to farm for 9 days straight. He pumped water from Voorhees Creek into stock tanks across this county. He saved 47 farms. He saved 3,200 head of cattle. He refused every dollar that was offered to him. Warren paused. He told me once when I tried to pay him that there were 6 more farms before lunch, and he had to keep moving. The yard was completely silent. A man in the 6th row had taken off his hat and was holding it against his chest without seeming to realize he had done it. That tractor, Warren said, is Gideon Calloway's tractor. The exact machine he drove for 9 days in that storm. And that young woman at the back of this yard is Gideon Calloway's granddaughter. Harlan Voss was 66 years old. He was a farmer in northeastern Crail County. He had been 38 in January of 1959, standing in his own barn doorway on the second night of the storm, listening to his cattle, and knowing what the sounds meant, and knowing there was nothing he could do about them. He remembered the morning 2 days later when he had walked out to the road and seen the Farmall M come around the bend through the steam and ice. He remembered what it had felt like to stop being alone with a problem he could not solve. His father had made him promise on a deathbed in 1982 that if the day ever came when Harlan could do something to honor what Gideon Calloway had done, he should do it without hesitation. Harlan Voss stood up. He took off his cap. He held it against his chest and turned to face the back of the yard. My farm was one of the 47, he said, loud enough for the yard to hear. My father told me about Gideon Calloway from his deathbed. I would not bid against this young woman if everything I owned depended on it. A second man stood, then a third. By the time the 5th man had risen from the bleachers with his hat in his hand, the yard was as quiet as any place that contains 200 people can be. Boyd Crane stood in the 3rd row and did not make a sound. Warren looked out at the men standing with their caps against their chests. He looked at the 1949 Farmall M at the back of the equipment line, with its flat tires and its dead battery and its paint gone to rust in long streaks down the hood. He looked at Nora Calloway. He brought the gavel down. Sold. Lot 17. 1949 Farmall M to Miss Nora Calloway of Mitchellville, Iowa. $100. Nora lowered her paddle. She had counted the $100 out the night before, separated it from the rest of the money in the envelope, folded it once and put it in the left pocket of the wool coat. She reached into that pocket now and walked toward the registration table. Her hands were not shaking. They had been shaking since she got off the bus that morning, but they were not shaking now. She paid. She signed the paperwork. She turned from the table and walked through the crowd, which parted for her in the way crowds part for something they are not entirely sure how to categorize, and she walked down the length of the equipment line to the far end, where the Farmall M stood on its flat tires in the cold morning air. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she reached up with both hands, her grandfather's gloves still on her hands, and she took hold of the steering wheel. The cold of the metal came through the leather. It was the same cold that had come through these same gloves on January 18, 1959, when Gideon Calloway had gripped this same wheel on a frozen road in -22 air and driven towards 6 more farms before lunch. Nora Calloway gripped the wheel and she did not let go, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry since the day she understood that the farm was gone, and the man who had raised her was not coming back. She cried without covering her face. She cried in front of 200 men who 4 minutes earlier had been laughing at her. None of them were laughing now. Harlan Voss walked down to where she stood. He was a large man, hands calloused from a lifetime of work, a face that had been weathered into something that weather could no longer do much more to. He stood beside the tractor and waited until Nora had finished and turned to look at him. "Miss Calloway," he said, "my name is Harlan Voss. My farm was one of the 47. I have been waiting since 1959 for a way to do what I owe." Nora looked at him. She did not say anything. "How are you planning to get this tractor home?" Harlan asked. Nora thought about the bus ticket in her other pocket, the $1.45 it had cost, the 3-hour ride from Mitchellville, the fact that she had spent 9 months solving the problem of buying the tractor and had not yet solved the problem of what came after. "I do not know yet," she said. "I will figure it out." Harlan nodded. He turned back toward the yard, where a small group of older men had begun making their way down the equipment line. Dale Sherwood, Walt Deering, men in their 50s and 60s who had seen Warren stand at that podium and say the name Gideon Calloway, and had reached for their hats before they were fully aware of having done it. They gathered around the Farmall M and spoke quietly among themselves. Nora stood close enough to hear pieces of it, but not all. Names of farms, a year, the number 9. Then Harlan turned back to her. "Miss Calloway," he said, "with your permission, we would like to handle getting this tractor to where it needs to go. New tires, new battery. Get the engine running properly. We know men who do this kind of work, and we know where to do it. We consider it a privilege." Nora looked at the group of men standing around her grandfather's tractor in the cold November air. She looked at Harlan. She looked at Dale Sherwood, who was running his hands slowly along the fender of the Farmall M with an expression that had nothing to do with mechanics. "I cannot pay you for that," she said. "Miss Calloway," Harlan said, "you will not pay 1 dime. That machine saved my farm in the winter of 1959. There is no payment large enough for what your grandfather did. There is only what we can do now." He looked at her steadily. "Where do you need it delivered when it is ready?" Nora thought about Agnes Tully's small house on Maple Street. The narrow yard, the street parking, the way the neighboring houses came right up to the property line. "I'm staying with my great-aunt in Mitchellville," she said. "There is no room there. I do not have a place for it." Dale Sherwood spoke up. He was 52 years old, a man whose directness had not been softened by decades of polite conversation. "I have a barn with empty space 6 miles east of Mitchellville," he said. "I will keep it there for you free of charge for as long as you need. When you are ready, you come and get it. It will be there." "Are you sure?" Nora said. Dale looked at her with the expression of a man who does not repeat himself, because he means what he says the first time. "I am as sure as I have ever been about anything in my life." She had $240 left in the envelope. She had a tractor she could not move and a barn 6 miles away that would hold it. She had solved the first problem. She had not yet solved any of the ones that came after. She was 14 years old, and she understood, standing with her hands on that wheel in the cold November air, that she had just committed herself to the longest road of her life. They kept their word. Through the cold months of that winter, working on weekends in Dale Sherwood's shop, 6 miles east of Mitchellville, the 1949 Farmall M was brought back. New tires, new battery, a rebuilt carburetor. Fresh paint matched as closely as anyone could manage to the original International Harvester red. The work was done by men who had been touched by what Gideon Calloway had done in January of 1959, either directly or through their fathers. And they did it without ceremony, and without any expectation that someone would write it down. Dale moved the tractor into his barn before Christmas. Nora came to see it for the first time in March of 1988. Agnes drove her out, having been told the truth about the November auction only after it was over, having sat at her kitchen table for a long time, after hearing it without saying anything, and having then put on her coat and said that they should go. Dale opened the barn door. The Farmall M stood in the clean light from the half-loft window, the red paint fresh. The tires full, the chrome on the instrument panel polished to a brightness it had not had in years. Nora walked to it. She climbed up into the cab. She sat in the driver's seat and put her hands on the wheel. And outside the barn, Agnes Tully and Dale Sherwood stood near the door without moving, and neither of them spoke. 45 minutes passed. When Nora climbed down, her face was dry. She looked at Dale. "Thank you," she said. Dale nodded once. "It will be here when you need it." He drove them back to Mitchellville. The fields went past the window, brown and flat in the March cold, waiting for the spring that was still weeks away. Nora watched them go by. She was 15 years old. She had a grandfather's tractor sitting in a barn 6 miles away, and 320 acres of land that did not belong to her anymore, somewhere out there beyond the glass. And she was already thinking about the next problem. She had learned that from Gideon Calloway, who had looked at everything that needed doing, and then done the next thing and then the thing after that. The first thing she learned about grief was that it did not announce itself on a schedule. It arrived in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in Agnes Tully's kitchen, when the smell of something on the stove was suddenly without warning the exact smell of her grandfather's kitchen on a winter morning, and she had to put down her pencil and sit very still for a moment, breathing carefully the way you breathe when you are trying to keep something from spilling. It arrived in the middle of the night. It arrived on the school bus when the fields outside were the same fields she had watched from a different window, a window that had been hers. The second thing she learned was that grief could be used, not resolved, not defeated, used, turned in a direction, given a purpose larger than itself. She had understood this by the time she was 15. Not in those words, but in the practical way that people understand things they have reached through necessity rather than theory. Nobody was coming to fix it. That was the third thing, and it was the most useful one. She was a serious student in the way of someone who is not performing seriousness, but simply working toward a specific destination that requires it. By her junior year at Mitchellville High, she was at the top of her class in science and mathematics, solid in English, and had developed a particular interest in agricultural economics that her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Ogle, who had grown up on a farm in Boone County, recognized and quietly encouraged. Mrs. Ogle was the one who set a brochure on Nora's desk in October of her junior year. Without comment, without pressure, in the way a good teacher places something in front of a student and lets the student decide what to do with it, Nora read the brochure that night. Iowa State University Agricultural Scholarship Program. She filled out the application over 3 consecutive weekends. She wrote the required essay about her grandfather and about 320 acres of Iowa topsoil that had been farmed continuously since 1946, and about what it meant to understand land at a level that went below technique and into something older. She did not write about the auction or the tractor or the $100. She mailed the application herself. She did not tell Agnes until the acceptance letter arrived in April of 1991. Agnes read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she looked up at Nora with an expression that was complicated in the way that the expressions of people who have done their best with situations too large for them become complicated when they find out after years of uncertainty that it was somehow enough. "Your grandfather would have liked this," Agnes said. "I know," Nora said. She arrived at Iowa State in the fall of 1991. The scholarship covered tuition. She worked. She had been working since she was 13, and she did not stop now. She waitressed at a diner near campus on weekends. She filed papers at the Agricultural Extension Office 2 afternoons a week. She lived in a manner that would have looked like deprivation to her classmates, if any of them had paid close enough attention, but none of them did. because Nora was not the kind of person who made her circumstances visible unless she chose to. Every semester, after paying rent and food and the minimum of everything else, she put whatever was left into a savings account at a bank in Ames, not because it would ever be enough by itself, but because the habit of accumulation was the only thing she knew how to do with a destination she could not yet reach. In the summer between her freshman and sophomore years, she took a student internship at the Iowa Department of Agriculture in Des Moines. Her supervisor was a man named Harwick, methodical and precise, who assigned her to a series of land use analyses without much explanation, and waited to see what she did with them. 3 weeks into the placement, Harwick set a file on her desk for a standard transfer analysis, a parcel in northeastern Crail County changing hands from an investment group to a commercial developer. Nora opened the file. She read the legal description. She looked at the coordinates. She closed the file and opened it again. The parcel bordered the eastern edge of her grandfather's land. She completed the analysis, every column, every notation, the language exact, and without deviation from the template. She put it on Harwick's desk the following morning. He read it, turned the last page, looked up. "This is unusually thorough for a summer placement," he said. Nora said nothing for a moment. "I know that land," she said. And she left it there without explanation, without elaboration, because there was nothing more to say that the work had not already said for her. Harwick looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he had already understood. He nodded slowly and did not ask her anything further. But from that point on, the files he put on her desk were not the routine ones. She was back at Iowa State in September when the letter arrived at Agnes Tully's house on Maple Street. Agnes forwarded it to the campus address. It came in a plain envelope typed from a company called Pinnacle Agricultural Holdings, with an address in Omaha, Nebraska. The letter was brief and professional. It expressed interest in acquiring land in Crail County and requested a meeting with Nora Calloway at her earliest convenience regarding a parcel formerly associated with the Calloway family estate. Agnes had written one line at the top of the forwarded envelope in her careful, slanted hand. "I told him you were at school." Nora read the letter. She folded it and put it in the drawer of her dormitory desk. She did not write back. She did not tell anyone she had received it. 2 weeks later, Preston Hale walked into the Iowa Department of Agriculture. He was 34 years old, tall in a navy suit that had not come off of rack shoes that were not made for walking in mud. He had the manner of a man who had been told yes by enough people in enough rooms that the possibility of being told no had stopped occurring to him as a realistic outcome. He asked at the front desk for Nora Calloway. He was told she was a summer intern and was not currently in the building. He left his card and said he would return. He returned on a Tuesday in mid-September, on a day Nora was in the building processing deed records for Harwick. Someone from the front desk brought the card to her desk. She went out to the lobby. Preston Hale looked at her the way people sometimes look at a situation they expected to be more complicated and have just realized is not. He introduced himself. He explained that Pinnacle Agricultural Holdings operated several 100,000 acres across Iowa and Nebraska and was expanding its presence in Crail County. He said they were prepared to offer fair market value, possibly above market for the right parcels. He said he understood she had an interest in land that was currently held by Westfield Land Partners out of Des Moines. He said it the way a man says something when he believes the saying of it is already most of the work. Then he said, "Miss Calloway, you are a sophomore in college. You have no assets, no credit, and no farming history under your own name. The land your grandfather worked is going to sell. The only question is whether it sells to someone who will farm it or to someone who will develop it. We farm it. I would think carefully before you let sentiment make this decision for you." Nora sat with that for a moment. The lobby of the Iowa Department of Agriculture was not a large space. Through the window behind Preston Hale's left shoulder, the Des Moines skyline sat low and gray in the September light. "I appreciate you coming in person, Mr. Hale," she said. She stood up. He understood the conversation was over. He walked back through the lobby and out through the glass doors, and Nora watched him go, and then she went back to her desk and opened her drawer and took out a yellow legal pad and wrote Preston Hale's name at the bottom of a list that was already 2 pages long. The list was not of enemies. It was of problems arranged in the order they needed to be solved, and Preston Hale had just placed himself on it. She graduated from Iowa State in May of 1994 with a degree in agricultural science and a focus in land management. She took a position at the Iowa Department of Agriculture in Des Moines entry level, doing land use analysis and soil conservation reporting. The pay was steady. It put her inside the world of Iowa agriculture at a level that allowed her to understand things her coursework had only approximated. She rented a small apartment in Des Moines. She continued to save. By the end of 1994, she had $14,000. By early spring of 1995, $19,000. She knew $19,000 was not enough to buy 320 acres of central Iowa farmland. She had known this for years. She had also known for years that she was going to have to solve the problem of the gap between what she had and what the land would cost in some way that was not simply a matter of saving longer. She had been thinking about the shape of that solution for a long time. In November of 1994, on a Wednesday evening in the dormitory room, she had kept through the end of her senior year because it was cheaper than an apartment. She sat with a binder of notes and a yellow legal pad covered on both sides with numbers. She had been making calls. Careful calls framed as reconnection, as catching up as the ordinary kind of contact a young woman from Crail County might make with people her grandfather had known. She had spoken to 9 families whose names appeared on Dale Sherwood's list. 6 had indicated in various ways and at various levels of certainty that they would consider what she was about to propose. 3 had not yet answered either way. She needed 10. She had calculated this carefully, running the numbers from multiple angles, building in loss reserves using conservative yield projections, assuming commodity prices at their lower historical averages. 10 investors, each contributing between $50,000 and $70,000, enough to reach the asking price of whatever Westfield eventually set enough to demonstrate to the Land Records Office in Crail County that the offer was serious and immediately executable. She sat with the legal pad for a long time that night. At some point, not knowing exactly when she had done it, she wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. "What if this does not work?" She looked at it. The question sat there in her own handwriting in the quiet of the room, and it was the most honest thing she had written in 9 months of careful, structured planning. She folded the page in half. She put it in the desk drawer. She did not burn it. She did not tear it. She folded it and put it away because the doubt was real, and pretending it did not exist was not the same as being strong, and she had learned the difference somewhere in the years between the auction yard and now. Then she opened the binder and went back to work. The 10th name came through in January of 1995, the 11th in February. By March, she had 12, and by March, she had also received the news she had been watching for. Russell Hatch, a land records clerk at the Department of Agriculture who had learned over 18 months that Nora Calloway was interested in a specific parcel in Crail County and would appreciate knowing if its status changed, left a note on her desk on a Thursday afternoon. Westfield Land Partners, 320 acres, Crail County, listed for sale. Asking price $640,000. Nora looked at the number for a long time. Then she got in her car and drove to Dale Sherwood's farm. It was a Saturday in early March. The ground was still frozen. The fields were bare and gray under a sky that had not decided yet whether it was done with winter. Dale was in his shop working on a piece of tillage equipment when she pulled into the drive. He looked up when she came in, took in her expression, and set down the wrench. "Coffee," he said. They went into the kitchen. Dale poured 2 cups from a pot that had been on the burner for several hours. Nora sat down. She told him about the listing. She told him about the price. She told him about the $19,000. Then she said what she had not said out loud to anyone since she had started thinking it 3 years earlier. "Dale," she said, "how many of the farms on your list are still operating?" Dale Sherwood put down his cup. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and is taking a moment to confirm that the moment is exactly what it appears to be. Then he stood up and walked to the desk in the corner of the kitchen. He opened the second drawer from the top. He took out a piece of paper folded in quarters, soft with age, the fold lines worn thin from being opened and refolded over many years. He set it on the table in front of Nora. She unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, and even in ink that had faded from black to a dark brown over the decades. At the top, in that same hand, January 1960. Below it, a column of names, farm names and family names and addresses with pencil notations beside each entry in different shades of gray that told their own quiet story of years and updates in the slow passage of everything. 31 entries. 31 farms still operating as of the most recent notation Nora could find, which appeared to be from late 1994. She looked up at Dale. "I've kept that list since 1960, he said. "I update it every year. I call around. I drive past. I check the county records." He was quiet for a moment. "I do not know why I started keeping it. I just did. And I did not stop." Nora looked back at the list. Then she looked at Dale Sherwood, who had kept a tractor running for 8 years, and a list updated for 35, and had never said a word about either to anyone who had not earned the right to hear it. "Dale," she said, "I have a plan." She had been calling it a plan in her own mind for months. What it actually was, as she spread it out across Dale's kitchen table that March afternoon, was 11 pages of single-spaced typewritten text, covering every aspect of a proposed partnership agreement between Nora Calloway and a consortium of investor partners drawn from the farming community of Crail County. She had spent 6 months writing it. The structure was straightforward. The consortium would contribute the capital to purchase the 320 acres at Westfield's asking price. Nora would farm the land using sustainable practices designed to minimize input costs and maintain or improve soil quality over time. Revenue from the farming operation would be split 60% to the investors and 40% to Nora for the first 10 years, then reversed 40% to the investors and 60% to Nora for the following 5 years. At the end of year 15, Nora would have the right to buy out all consortium interest at fair market value, minus 20% in recognition of 15 years of land stewardship. It was not charity. It was not a gift. It was a business proposition built to protect the investor's capital while giving Nora a path to ownership that did not require her to begin with money she did not have. Dale read all 11 pages. He read them slowly without speaking, turning each page with the care of a man who doesn't skim things that matter. When he finished, he set the last page on the stack and looked at the wall behind Nora's head for a moment. Then he picked up the phone. The call Nora had not anticipated came 3 weeks into the process. It came from Mac Durbin, 58 years old, a farmer whose father's land was on Dale's list. Mac had signed a preliminary letter of intent in February. His son-in-law, it turned out, had been running his own numbers. Dale called Nora on a Tuesday evening at 10. He said Mac was out. He said Mac's son-in-law had presented the family with an analysis showing the investment was under-collateralized for the return profile, and that Mac had called that afternoon to say he was withdrawing. Nora was quiet for 10 seconds on the phone. "Which ones are watching to see what he does?" she said. Dale told her. "Two names. Do not say anything to either of them yet," she said. She drove to Mac Durbin's farm on Saturday morning. The sky was low and the fields were still the color of February, even though it was March. She knocked on the door. When Mac came out, she did not mention the phone call. Did not mention the son-in-law did not open with the plan or the numbers or the consortium structure. She took the 11 pages out of the folder she was carrying and set them on Mac's kitchen table. She sat down. She accepted the coffee he poured because it would have been wrong not to. Mac's wife, May, stood at the kitchen doorway and did not come in or leave. Mac read in silence. He turned pages the way Dale had turned them carefully. After 20 minutes, he asked about the contingency reserve line item. Nora explained it. He asked a second question about the buyout valuation methodology. She explained that too. Then the kitchen was quiet. May Durbin came in from the doorway. She sat down across from Nora without being invited and without needing to be. She looked at Nora for a moment with the direct assessing look of a woman who has been watching and listening from the other room and has made up her mind. "My father-in-law came home from that storm in '59, May said, and sat at this table and he cried. He never cried about anything else in his life. Not when the drought took the corn in '67. Not when we lost the East Quarter in '82. Only that one time." She looked at her husband. "Mac," she said. "Just his name. Nothing more." Mac Durbin looked at the 11 pages on his kitchen table. He looked at his wife. He looked at Nora. "When do you need the answer?" he said. "When you are ready," Nora said. 3 days later, Mac Durbin called. He was in. Within 2 weeks, 12 farmers had committed. Within 4 weeks, $640,000 sat in an escrow account at a bank in Des Moines, not pledged, not promised, deposited and ready. What Nora did not know while this was happening was that Westfield Land Partners had received another offer. Pinnacle Agricultural Holdings, the company out of Omaha, had submitted a cash offer $20,000 above Westfield's asking price. Their acquisition manager had visited the property in February and had assessed it as a sound addition to their operational footprint. The paperwork was clean. The company was well capitalized. Westfield's attorney was recommending acceptance. The decision landed on the desk of Owen Mercer, the managing partner of Westfield Land Partners. Mercer was 55 years old. He had grown up in Kossuth County in northern Iowa, 2 counties removed from Crail. His father had farmed. His father had not been one of the 47 the farm too far north for a single man with a 200-gallon tank to reach in 9 days. But his father had known the story. In farming communities in Iowa, in the years after 1959, the story of Gideon Calloway in that winter was not ancient history. It was the kind of story that fathers told sons at the right moment when they were trying to explain something about what kind of person a person ought to be. Not a lecture, just a story told once and carried. Owen Mercer's father had told him that story on a November evening in 1971. Owen had been 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. He could not have told you now at 55 what had prompted his father to tell it that particular evening. But he remembered the name. When Dale Sherwood called the Westfield offices to introduce the consortium offer, the receptionist put Dale through to Owen Mercer's assistant, and the assistant put it in the queue, and it came to Owen's desk as a summary document on a Thursday morning alongside 11 other items. Owen read the summary. He read the name of the farming partner, Nora Calloway, granddaughter of Gideon Calloway. He set the document down. He looked at nothing in particular for approximately 2 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Dale Sherwood back directly. He listened to the terms of the consortium agreement. He asked Dale to confirm once who the farming partner was and how she was connected to the Calloway name. Dale confirmed it. Owen Mercer said, "We will take the consortium offer." His attorney spent 30 minutes explaining why this was financially inadvisable. Owen listened to every word. When the attorney finished, Owen said, "Drop the papers. The Omaha offer is $20,000 higher, Owen. I know what it is. Drop the papers." He did not explain further. There are things that cannot be explained to the wrong audience and do not require explanation to the right one. Owen Mercer understood the difference. Preston Hale received the news on a Friday afternoon in his Omaha office. He called Owen Mercer directly. "This is not how real estate works, Owen," he said. "You are leaving $20,000 on the table for a consortium deal with no anchor asset and a farming partner who has never operated a single acre under her own name." "The paperwork is already filed," Preston Owen said. "I am asking you to reconsider. My offer is clean, it is above market, and it closes in 30 days. Owen said, "The paperwork is filed." He ended the call. Preston Hale sat in his leather chair in his Omaha office and looked at the phone in his hand. He had been acquiring land in Iowa for 3 years. He had closed 19 transactions. He had not lost one of them not to a competing offer, not to a seller changing their mind, not to a legal complication. He had built his professional identity around the certainty that money applied with sufficient directness resolved most situations in its favor. He sat there for a long time. The papers were drawn up. The consortium offer was accepted. The sale was scheduled to close on June 14th, 1995. Nora received the call from the escrow attorney on a Tuesday morning in early June, while she was at her desk at the Department of Agriculture. She sat very still after she hung up. The office around her continued at its normal pace. None of it registered. June 14th, she said to herself. She called Dale Sherwood from a payphone in the building lobby. She told him the date. Dale said he would call the others. On the morning of June 14th, Nora Calloway drove from her apartment in Des Moines to Dale Sherwood's farm. She was 22 years old. She had $19,000 in her savings account and a degree in agricultural science and a job she was about to resign from. She stopped the car at the end of Dale's drive and sat for a moment. Then she looked east across the flat fields toward the part of Crail County where her grandfather's land lay waiting. The corn was already a foot high in the June warmth. She got out of the car and walked to the house. Dale's kitchen was crowded in the way of a room not designed for 12 people. The men who had committed their capital and their faith to this arrangement were standing in the spaces between the table and the counter and the doorway. Men in their 60s and 70s in work clothes, men who had driven to a farmhouse on a Saturday morning. Because this was the kind of thing you showed up for in person. Harlan Voss sat in the corner near the window, 74 years old. His hair entirely white. His hands on the table, the hands of a man who had worked land his entire life. He was not speaking. He was sitting very still with the expression of a man who has carried something for a long time and is very close now to being allowed to set it down. Mac Durbin was there. He stood near the back next to Walt Daring and 2 others Nora had come to know over the months of calls and kitchen table conversations, and the slow accumulation of trust that comes from showing people a plan and letting them find its edges, and ask the hard questions, and then showing them that you had already thought about the hard questions. The closing attorney had set his briefcase on Dale's kitchen table and organized the paperwork into the stacks that needed to be signed in a particular order. Nora sat down at the table. The room was quiet in the way of a room where everyone present understands the weight of what is about to happen. She picked up the pen. She signed the first document, the second. The pages that followed the legal infrastructure of a transaction that was at its core, not a transaction at all, but a restoration. The slow and deliberate return of something that had been taken from a family that could not defend itself against the simple arithmetic of a dead man's debt, and a bank that was owed money, and a legal system that moves at the speed it moves. She signed the last page. The closing attorney confirmed the wire transfer. He shook hands with the consortium members and with Nora and said the things closing attorneys say, which are professional and correct, and which landed in that room without weight, because everything that mattered had already happened in the moment. The pen moved across the line. 320 acres. Back where it had always been supposed to be. Harlan Voss, who had stood up first in the auction yard 8 years ago with his hat against his chest, was not crying. He was simply sitting very still. Looking at Nora, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has spent a long time carrying something he was never supposed to carry alone, and has finally in this kitchen on this morning found the person he was supposed to hand it to. Dale poured coffee. The men began to talk quietly, the way men talk when something significant has happened, and they are not entirely sure yet how to hold it. They talked about the weather and the planting season and the practical questions of what equipment Nora would need for the first season and who might have something to lend. Nora sat at the table and listened and drank her coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the June field stretched east toward the land that now, in the language of legal documents and property records and the straightforward arithmetic of signed papers, belonged to the Calloway family again. She allowed herself for just that one morning to be exactly where she was. The work began the next morning. Not in the house, which needed more repair than one season could address. Not with ceremony or announcement. It began in the quiet way that everything Nora Calloway had ever done began, which was simply by beginning before the conditions were ideal, before anyone was watching, before there was any reason to believe that the beginning itself was worth marking. She had spent her first winter on the land living in the farmhouse anyway, because she was not the kind of person who waits for conditions to be right before starting, and because there was something important to her about being on the ground through its first winter. Back in the family, even if that meant a drafty kitchen and a furnace that required coaxing every morning, and a ceiling in the bedroom that had developed a water stain she chose not to think about. She fixed what she could fix herself through those months. She added the rest to a list. She had a great many lists by then, and she had learned to trust them. On a Tuesday morning in early April of 1996, the ground having thawed enough the week before to accept the weight of equipment without compacting, which Nora had tested by walking the fields herself on a Sunday afternoon and pressing her heel into the soil every 20 yards and reading what the earth told her, the way Gideon had taught her to read it when she was young enough that she had to reach up to take his hand. While they walked, she drove out to the equipment shed before sunrise. The shed held the borrowed machinery she had arranged for the first season: a planter, a grain drill, a cultivator, all older equipment lent by consortium members who had more than they needed and had offered without being asked. And at the far end of the shed, the 1949 Farmall M, which Dale Sherwood and Harlan Voss had trailered from Dale's barn in March on a cold Saturday morning with 2 of the other consortium men following in their own trucks. A small procession nobody had organized, but that had assembled itself the way things assemble when the people involved understand without discussion what is being marked. Nora climbed into this cab in the dark. The seat was cold. She sat for a moment with her hands on her knees, looking at the inside of the equipment shed, at the tools hanging on the wall, at the shapes of the borrowed machinery in the shadows. Then she set her hands on the wheel. She turned the key. The engine caught on the second try, which was better than she had expected for an April morning, and she felt the machine come alive beneath her, the way properly maintained machines do not. With a struggle, but with a kind of inevitability, as if this was simply what it had been waiting to do. She let it warm up. She sat in the cold cab with the engine running and she listened. It was the same sound, the same specific weight and rhythm she had heard described, never forgotten, carried across 28 years of other people's faithfulness to a morning on an ice road she had not been alive to witness. She understood, sitting there in the dark before the first light of an April dawn, why Warren Pruitt had stood at his barn door 37 years ago and not believed his own ears. Because a sound that carries that kind of meaning should not exist on the road you are standing on. And yet there it is. She pulled out of the shed as the first light came up in the east. She drove the Farm All M slowly around the perimeter of the home quarter 160 acres, not at working speed, but at the speed of looking, the deliberate pace of a person who wants to see every foot of something clearly. The wheels moved through the soft spring ground and left tracks that filled slowly with water in the pale early light. She completed the circuit without stopping. Then she went back to the shed, switched to the planter, and went to work. The first crop year was corn and soybeans on a rotation schedule she had designed through the winter, drawing on everything she had studied at Iowa State and everything she had read since, and the specific knowledge of this particular soil that she had been accumulating since childhood. She was not reinventing what Gideon had done. She was continuing it, adjusting it for what she now understood that he had practiced instinctively, without having the formal language to describe it. The deep relationship between a farmer and a specific piece of ground that develops only over decades, that cannot be purchased or transferred or inherited intact, that must be lived into year by year until the soil and the person farming it have developed a mutual understanding that resembles more than anything else trust. She farmed largely alone that first year. Harlan Voss came out in June to help with a cultivation problem she had not anticipated arriving without being called, because he had driven past the field on his way to town and seen from the road what needed doing. He spent 4 hours in the heat and drove home without eating lunch. Walt Daring lent her a grain cart in August that she could not have afforded to rent. Dale Sherwood called every 2 weeks to ask one question about how the season was going, and the answer Nora gave each time in the same tone was the answer she meant, which was that she was managing and that she appreciated the question. The crop came in that fall. Not a record year, not a disaster. A solid first year on land that had been farmed by a tenant for 7 years and was now being farmed by someone who intended to stay. The soil knew the difference, Nora believed, though she would not have said so to anyone who might have questioned it. The soil always knows whether the person farming it is passing through or staying. She was staying. The years that followed settled into the rhythm of farming life, which from the outside appears repetitive, and from the inside is never the same twice. A wet spring in 1998 that delayed planting 3 weeks and required decisions about variety selection she had not planned for. A drought in 2000 that took 20% off her yields and required her to draw on the loss reserve built into the partnership agreement, which was there for exactly this reason, and which she replenished over the following 2 years with the same methodical steadiness with which she had approached every financial obligation since she was 13 years old and counting money in a cookie tin. A period in 2003 and 2004 when commodity prices compressed her margins to a width that required her to examine every input cost and make decisions about what was essential and what was not. She made the decisions. She kept the operations solvent. She submitted detailed financial reports to the consortium every quarter, transparent. whether the numbers were good or difficult, because the agreement required it, and because an agreement means exactly what it says, not what is convenient. She never missed a distribution, not once in 15 years. Warren Pruitt died in the spring of 2003. He was 80 years old. Nora heard the news on a Friday evening from Dale, who called because he thought she would want to know before she read it in the paper. She sat for a while after the call in her kitchen, which she had repaired and repainted over the winter in the spring light that was still in the western windows. She thought about Warren standing at his podium on a November morning in 1987, looking at a bidder card with her name on it, taking his glasses off. She thought about the weight that had come into his voice when he told the story to that yard. The 34 years he had carried that morning before he had found the way to put it down. The funeral was on a Saturday. Nora trailered the Farmall M from the farm that morning, not certain until she was loading it whether she was going to do what she was thinking about doing, and then deciding with the logic she had developed for these kinds of decisions that the question was simply whether it was the right thing, not whether it was a comfortable thing or a conventional thing or a thing that would not attract attention. She parked it at the edge of the cemetery lot during the graveside service. She could see it from where she stood. Several people around her could see it too, though no one said anything during the service itself. Afterward, Harlan Voss walked to where she was standing. He was slower now and used a cane on uneven ground. But his handshake was still the handshake of a working farmer, and his eyes were still the eyes of a man who paid attention. Warren would have liked that, he said, nodding toward the tractor at the edge of the lot. "I know," Nora said. Harlan looked at the Farmall M for a moment with the expression she had seen in the auction yard 16 years ago, the look of a man in the presence of a debt being properly honored. Then he asked how the land was. She told him it was good. He nodded, and they stood together for a moment in the spring light. And then he said he had to get back to his farm, and she said she needed to get the tractor loaded, and they shook hands and went in their separate directions. In the summer of 2001, a lawyer named Garrett Flynn had come to the farm on behalf of a real estate investment group looking to acquire agricultural parcels in Crail County. He was young, well-dressed for the drive out from Des Moines, and he had a prepared presentation that he delivered in Nora's kitchen, with the confidence of someone accustomed to transactions going smoothly. When he finished, Nora poured more coffee and told him without any particular inflection that a partnership agreement on record with the Crail County Clerk's office ran until 2010, and that she was not in a position to sell what was not entirely hers. She told him he was welcome to review the filing. He opened his mouth to continue, and she asked whether he would like more coffee before he drove back. He understood. He did not return. Preston Hale left Pinnacle Agricultural Holdings in 2003. The company was acquired by a larger operation out of Chicago, restructured and effectively dissolved by 2007. Nora learned this in a phone call from Russell Hatch about an unrelated land transfer mentioned in passing the way one professional mentions news to another professional. In the context of other business, she registered the information. She continued the conversation about the land transfer. In the spring of 2016, a pipeline company filed an application for a utility easement across the western edge of the Callaway property. They had eminent domain authority under Iowa law, and their lawyers sent a letter that was designed to communicate the inevitability of the outcome before the conversation had formally begun. Nora did not hire a lawyer immediately. She went to the Crail County Records Office and pulled the original closing documents from Gideon Callaway's 1946 purchase. She found what she had remembered seeing once years ago when she was preparing the consortium documents, a clause in the original deed typed in the language of 1946 land law, specifying that no utility or infrastructure easement could be granted across any portion of the described parcel without the express written consent of the landowner for a period of 99 years from the date of original conveyance. The clause ran until 2045. She copied the document. She sent it to the pipeline company's legal office with a cover note that read, "Please review Section 4, Paragraph B of the attached." The pipeline company rerouted their easement application 800 feet to the east, across land belonging to a different owner who had agreed to sell the right-of-way. Nora did not have any further contact with them. She did not think of it as a victory. She thought of it as exactly what it was, a piece of paper her grandfather had signed in 1946, because he was the kind of man who read what he was signing doing precisely what it had been kept to do. The buyout came in September of 2009. She had been running the numbers since early 2008, watching the projections converge on a date slightly ahead of the contracted schedule. By March of 2009, she had called the consortium's attorney and initiated the process. The paperwork took 3 months. Year 15 of the agreement would have been 2010. She completed the buyout in September of 2009, 14 years, and 3 months after the papers had been signed in Dale Sherwood's kitchen. 1 year ahead of schedule. She sent each consortium member a certified check for their final disbursement, calculated exactly according to the terms of the original agreement. Fair market value independently assessed by an agricultural land appraiser, minus 20%. Exactly as the contract specified. Every dollar accounted for. Every obligation fulfilled. 3 checks came back. Harlan Voss sent his back with a note written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man whose writing had grown slower and more considered with age. The note said, "I watched you bring it back. That is my payment. Do not send this again." Walt Daring mailed his back without a note. When Nora called him, he said he was comfortable and did not need it, and that the land looked good from the road. Then he said goodbye and hung up. Dale Sherwood held his check for 2 weeks, which Nora thought meant he was going to deposit it. Then it came back in a plain envelope, and inside the envelope, along with the check, was a photograph. She had not known the photograph existed. It had been taken in March of 1988 by someone she did not remember being present in the clean light, coming through the half-loft window of Dale's barn. The photograph showed a 15-year-old girl climbing up into the cab of the freshly restored Farmall M, her grandfather's leather gloves. On her hands, her face turned slightly toward the window and the light. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at the wheel. On the back, in Dale's handwriting, "I have been holding on to this. Thought you should have it. Keep the check." Nora sat at her kitchen table with the photograph for a long time. Outside, the September fields were in the last weeks before harvest, the corn standing tall and dry in the early autumn air. She looked at the girl in the photograph. The oversized gloves, the light from the window, the particular stillness of someone who has just arrived at the beginning of something and has not yet understood what it will cost or how long it will take or what it will ask of them before it is finished. She knew what it had cost. She knew how long it had taken. She knew what it had asked. She called Dale. She told him she was going to place all 3 uncashed amounts into a scholarship fund at the Crail County 4-H, designated for young people interested in agricultural careers, and that the fund would bear the names of the 3 men who had refused the payments. She told him she expected him not to argue about it. Dale was quiet for a moment. "That is fine, Nora," he said. She pressed him on the wording of the attribution, and he said she could handle it however she thought was right. And she said she thought naming it after him and Walt and Harlan was right. And he said again that was fine. And she said, "Thank you, Dale." And he said nothing further, which was the most eloquent thing he could have said. The scholarship fund was established that fall. There was no ceremony. A brief interview with a reporter from the Crail County Weekly, during which the reporter asked why she had set it up. And she said that 3 men had kept a tractor for 8 years and put their money into land. They would never farm themselves because of something that had happened in January of 1959, and that the scholarship existed, so that would not be forgotten. The reporter asked for the names of the three men. Nora provided them. When she said Dale Sherwood's name, there was a pause in her voice that she did not attempt to conceal, and that the reporter, to his credit, did not mention. Willa Calloway was born in 2002. Nora raised her alone in the farmhouse that had been repaired and repainted, and gradually, over years of incremental work, had become something that looked and felt like a home rather than a project. Willa grew up on that land the way Nora had grown up on different land, which is to say, with a physical knowledge of it that lived in the body rather than the mind in the legs, that knew where the ground was soft in wet springs, in the hands that could read a corn leaf in July and tell you something about the water table without any instrument. She was a quiet child, not shy. Quiet in the way of someone who is listening rather than waiting to speak, who stores things, rather than dispersing them, who moves through the world with the unhurried certainty of a person who has already decided on their direction and does not need to announce it. Dale Sherwood, who met her when she was 4 and had followed her progress with the interested attention of a man invested in this family's future, said once that she had something of Gideon in her, a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of people who have made up their minds. Willa studied agricultural engineering at Iowa State, the same institution, a different program arriving at the same destination from the angle of systems and infrastructure and the technological dimension of what farming was becoming. Her master's thesis was a precision soil monitoring framework for mid-scale Midwest operations, which was to say she had spent 2 years developing in formal academic terms the tools for understanding exactly the kind of ground her mother farmed. In the spring of 2026, she came home. Harlan Voss died in February of 2017. He was 96 years old, which was longer than a man who works land as hard as Harlan had worked his, had any actuarial right to expect, and perhaps a few years beyond that, which suggested that he had simply decided on a schedule and kept to it. The church was full in the way of funerals for men who lived long and worked honestly and stayed where they were planted. Nora sat near the front. She had earned the front, and she knew it, and she sat there without apology. At the graveside, a young man who introduced himself as Harlan's grandson asked her how she had known his grandfather. She told him, not the short version, the version that started in November of 1987 and moved backward to January of 1959, and then forward again through 30 years of a community keeping a promise to a dead man by keeping it to his granddaughter. She told it in the cold February air, the way it deserved to be told completely, because that was what a man who had stood up first when standing up mattered deserved to have said about him. The grandson listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet. "I did not know all of that," he said. "Most people do not." Nora said, "That is why it has to be told." Dale Sherwood was 91 years old. He had been in an assisted living facility in Des Moines for 3 years, following a fall in his kitchen in 2023. He had adapted to the new arrangement with the same practical equanimity with which he had adapted to everything else in a life that had not been short on things requiring adaptation. On the dresser in his room, he kept a photograph of his farm. On the wall beside the window, he kept a photograph of the Farmall M taken in his barn, sometime in the late 1980s. The red paint fresh, the light from the loft window falling across the hood. On the small table beside his chair, in a simple frame of plain wood, was the original list from January of 1960. 31 names, the careful, even handwriting in ink that had faded from black to brown over the decades. The pencil notations in varying shades of gray along the right margin, the record of 35 years of quiet maintenance. He had asked for it to be brought from the farm when he moved. He had not explained why. He had not needed to. Nora visited twice a month. She brought photographs of the crops printed on a small printer she had bought for this specific purpose, because Dale's eyesight no longer accommodated screens. She brought coffee from her kitchen in a thermos, the kind that had been sitting on the burner long enough to develop a particular character, because that was what Dale's kitchen had always produced. And she had decided that maintaining certain continuities was important. They talked about the land, about what she was planning for the next season, about what the soil tests were showing, about the corn market. Sometimes they talked about the men who were gone. Harlan, Walt Deering, who had died in 2014 at 88, still farming his last spring. Harold Finch, who had sold his farm in 2018 and died the following year, which Nora suspected was not a coincidence, because some men are so bound to their ground that the separation is its own kind of ending. On a visit in October, Dale reached over and took her hand. This was not something Dale Sherwood had done before in all the years she had known him. He had been a man who showed up and stayed, who kept a tractor running and a list updated, who opened barn doors and poured coffee and said exactly what he meant and nothing more. The taking of her hand was new, and it arrived with the weight of something that had been stored for a long time finding its way out. He held it for a while without speaking. Outside his window, the Des Moines skyline sat in the October light gray and clear, and without pretension, the honest light of a Midwest autumn that shows everything as it actually is. "I kept that tractor for 8 years, he said. "I know you did," she said. "8 years," he said again. "I ran the engine every month, kept the roof tight, checked the tires." He was quiet for a moment. "Those were the proudest 8 years of my life." Nora held his hand and looked out the window and thought about what it means to have lived a life in which the thing you are proudest of is 8 years, of keeping a promise to a girl whose grandfather saved 47 farms. She thought about Gideon Calloway, who would have said that everything that followed from that November morning in 1987 was simply the ordinary result of doing the next thing, and then the thing after that. He would have believed it. He would have been wrong about the word ordinary, and he would not have been persuaded otherwise, and so the argument would not have been worth making. But she would have made it if she could. She stayed an extra hour that afternoon. When she left, Dale was asleep in his chair with the afternoon light on his face, and the list from January of 1960 stood in its plain frame on the table beside him, and the photograph of the Farmall M hung on the wall where the light could reach it. Willa came home in April of 2026. She arrived on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day, which was exactly the right kind of day for an arrival that was not ordinary at all. She brought her equipment with her, the soil monitoring instruments, and the portable data systems that were the practical application of 2 years of thesis work. She did not make an announcement. She put her things in the room she had grown up in and came downstairs and poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table across from her mother and asked what was going on with the field moisture levels in the western section. They talked for 3 hours, not about legacy or inheritance or the weight of what had come before, about the western section and the drainage tile that might need extending, and the cover crop rotation, and the soil organic matter trends over the past decade, and whether the precision monitoring data Willa had developed could be integrated with the records Nora had kept by hand since 1996. 30 years of notebooks that contained a kind of knowledge no satellite instrument had yet learned to replicate. In the equipment shed, there was a space at the end of the row. Nora had left it there for 3 years. She had not explained this to anyone, including Willa, because it was not the kind of thing that required explanation to the right person. That evening, Willa walked out to the shed alone. Nora watched from the kitchen window. The shed door opened. The light inside came on. Willa stood in the doorway for a moment. looking at the space at the end of the row. Then she looked at the Farmall M in its place at the far end, the red paint that had been touched up twice over 30 years. The chrome still polished, the tires still full. She walked to it. She put her hand on the fender. She stood there for a moment in the way of someone who has grown up hearing about a thing and is now understanding for the first time, through the physical reality of her own hand on painted metal, what the thing actually is. She did not climb up into the cab. That was not hers to do tonight. She simply stood with her hand on the fender of the machine that had come around a bend on an ice road in January of 1959 and saved 47 farms, and then sat in a barn for 8 years, and then come home to the land it had always belonged to. She stood there for a long time in the quiet of the shed, with the single bulb burning overhead. Then she walked back to the house. On the morning of January 16th, every year, before the sun is up, Nora Calloway unlocks the equipment shed. She walks past the modern tractors, the planter, the grain cart, the tillage equipment that represents 30 years of accumulated working capital and careful decision-making and the kind of stewardship that does not announce itself but shows up in the numbers and in the soil and in the way the land responds to the person farming it. She walks to the far end of the shed. She climbs into the cab of the 1949 Farmall M. She puts her hands on the wheel. She turns the key. The engine catches. She lets it warm up sitting in the cold cab in the dark, listening to the sound of it in the enclosed space of the shed, the way she has listened to it for 30 years, learning new things about it. Each time, the way you learn new things about something you have known a long time, when you are paying the right kind of attention. Then she pulls out of the shed, and she drives slowly in whatever the January morning has decided to provide around the perimeter of the home quarter. 160 acres. The same circuit, the same speed. The tracks the wheels leave filling with water or with mud or with nothing at all depending on the ground, and the season, which is the nature of ground which changes and does not change, which is the same soil that was here before Gideon Calloway and will be here after everyone who knew his name is gone. Patient and dark and extraordinarily willing to grow whatever is asked of it by someone who understands how to ask. She does this on November 14th as well every year. The anniversary of the morning she stood at the back of a crowd of 200 men in her grandfather's gloves and held up a paddle that nobody thought belonged in her hands. She does not do it for sentiment exactly, though sentiment is part of it. She does it because there are things that must be practiced to be kept. The way a community keeps its history by telling it, even when the telling is difficult, even when the people who need to hear it have not yet learned why they need to hear it. The way a farmer keeps a piece of ground by working it through the years that do not feel like anything in particular. The ordinary years between the remarkable ones. The years that are the actual substance of a life. The way a debt is honored not by a single payment, but by the ongoing acknowledgement, quiet and without audience, of what was given and what was received, and what that gift continues to mean in the daily fact of being alive on this land. This January morning, when she completes the circuit and pulls the Farmall M back toward the shed, there is a figure standing in the doorway. Willa. She is 24 years old, in a canvas coat against the cold. Her hair pulled back. Her hands in her pockets, standing at the entrance to the equipment shed, in the gray pre-dawn light. She is not saying anything. She is simply there watching her mother bring the tractor home, watching the way the red machine moves through the dark field, at the pace of someone who is not in a hurry and is not stopping. Nora cuts the engine at the shed door. The sound of it dies into the cold morning air. For a moment, neither of them speaks. Then, Willa steps aside to let the tractor into the shed, and Nora drives it to its place at the far end, and parks it, and climbs down. and they walk together back toward the house where the kitchen light is on, and the coffee is made and the fields are waiting for the spring that is still weeks away, but is already in the way of Iowa spring's inevitable. It is the sound that stays longest, long after the cold and the dark and the particular quality of that January light have faded into the general texture of the day. The sound of a diesel engine in the cold morning air moving steadily through a field in Crail County, Iowa, not in a hurry, not stopping. The sound of someone who has looked at what needs doing and is doing it. One farm at a time, and then the next one, and then the one after that. The sound of an engine that came around a bend on an ice road in a winter that most people have forgotten, and saved 47 farms and refused every dollar it was ever offered, and sat in a barn for 8 years and came home and has been running faithfully every January since. The sound in the cold dark of a morning on 320 acres in Crail County, Iowa. That means exactly what it has always meant.